The alien slave girl thought. The one who saved her was the Harasser. What if the one thing you've always believed in, love, was never yours to choose? What if it was written in the stars, but not the ones you could see? What if love came not from the heart, but from the cold, distant corners of space, and the very universe you fought to survive in was determined to tear you apart? The galaxy is vast, dark, and unforgiving. Frank Wren had long stopped believing in fate, in destiny. He had been to hell and back, and had killed for reasons that no longer mattered. But the universe has a strange way of turning things upside down. It's a cosmic joke, and Frank? He's the punchline. His latest mission was simple: find the traitor, eliminate the threat. But when he landed on Vihar 9, everything changed. The air was toxic, the planet forgotten. Yet in the heart of it all, he found her. She wasn't human. Her eyes shone with an unnatural glow, and her skin, cold, blue, as if the universe had carved her from the stars themselves. She wasn't supposed to be alive. But there she stood, waiting. Not for rescue. Not for salvation. But for something far worse. Pain. And in that moment, Frank knew that this mission? It wasn't about a traitor anymore. It was about him. About a choice he'd never seen coming. Could he save someone for the first time in his life? Or would he, too, become a prisoner of fate? You think love is simple, don't you? But what if it's a weapon, meant to break you apart? Hold on tight. Because this story? It's not going to be what you expect. Make sure you stay until the end. You'll want to know how it ends. Or, maybe, you'll want to choose how it ends. Because love, in this universe, isn't something you find, it's something you survive. Frank Wren stood on the landing platform of Valera 9, the shuttle's engines still buzzing faintly in the background. The air smelled of damp stone and cold moss, an odd, almost suffocating fragrance that reminded him of old memories he preferred to forget. He glanced at the girl, the empathy, the one he had bought, freed, and killed for, but now she wasn't just some asset. She was a living, breathing enigma. The words that ran through his mind didn't make sense to him. What does she even want? But something in his gut told him this wasn't just about survival anymore. She stepped off the shuttle, her steps as quiet as the mist that swirled around the platform. Her long black hair framed her face like ink spilling into a glass of water, and her violet eyes, those eyes that could pierce through the deepest lies, didn't look at him. Not yet. Frank adjusted his coat, wrapping it tighter around himself, as the cool wind brushed past him. It's a mistake, he told himself. She's not my problem anymore. I bought her, I freed her. We're done. But his footsteps faltered as she passed him, her presence in the air too heavy, too real. He wasn't ready for this. You don't have to follow me, Frank said over his shoulder, his voice rougher than he wanted it to sound. She didn't answer. Instead, she walked beside him, her posture straight and unwavering. It wasn't fear or defiance he saw in her, no, it was something much worse. She wasn't expecting safety. She wasn't waiting for salvation. She was waiting for the next blow. She was prepared for pain, not for kindness. What did they do to you? Frank shook his head, his mind battling between guilt and a strange urge to protect her, even though he knew it wasn't his place. He was the one who had let her go through hell. He was the one who had walked away from Tyrion's gate when the order was given to kill the civilians. He hadn't been able to save her then, and now, now he didn't know what he was doing. They reached the front door of his estate. It wasn't much, just a weathered stone structure buried in the mist, half hidden by vines and the passage of time. Frank swiped a code into the panel on the side, and the door creaked open. The interior was dim, lit by faint glowing fungi that clung to the walls. The house was simple, old, and forgotten by most. There were no guards, no security cameras watching her every move. There was no one. Just the two of them. Frank gestured for her to enter. She hesitated. "It's not locked," he said, his voice quieter now. "Do what you want." She looked at him for a moment before stepping inside. She didn't touch anything, just stood there, eyes scanning the room like a prisoner who'd been freed, unsure if freedom was really what it seemed. Frank let the door close behind them, the silence hanging heavy between them. This wasn't supposed to be this way, he thought. She wasn't supposed to be here, and I wasn't supposed to care. But as she stood still, her back to the door, Frank's eyes softened. For the first time, he saw her not as the empathy who had suffered for years, but as a woman, a person who had been scarred by others but who, somehow, hadn't lost the strength to survive. "Your room's upstairs," Frank said, breaking the silence. "Second door on the right. You're not locked in here." Her gaze flickered towards him, then back to the walls. She didn't say anything, just turned and moved silently up the stairs. Frank watched her, feeling a strange mix of emotions he couldn't quite place. He waited for her to make the first move, but she didn't. She never would. He walked down the hall, stopping outside the room he used as his office. His fingers brushed the door frame, the old scars on his knuckles tingling with memories that hadn't healed. She was here. She was free. But was she? Frank poured himself a drink. The glass filled slowly, the amber liquid swirling, catching the dim light of the room. He didn't need to drink, it wasn't about the alcohol. It was the silence, the stillness, the emptiness that had followed him since Tyrion's gate. But now, with her in the house, everything felt different. She had never said a word to him. Not since they left the black market. Not even when he freed her, when he killed for her. But silence, Frank realized, was dangerous. It could speak louder than words. "What do you want from me?" he asked silently, though the words stayed trapped behind his teeth. He knew the answer already: nothing. She didn't want anything from him. She had learned long ago that nothing came without a price. She had been trained to expect pain, to expect loss. And Frank, he had never been anyone worth trusting. But when he saw her again, standing motionless in that cage, something inside him stirred. Not guilt, not pity. Recognition. She wasn't a slave to him, she was a reflection of what he had failed to save. Her face still haunted him. The girl from Tyrion's gate. The girl he had failed. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. But now, she was here. And something deep inside Frank told him he couldn't just walk away. Not again. He downed the glass in one swift motion, the burn of the liquor doing nothing to dull the ache inside him. He set the glass down on the counter and stood still, listening. He wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in a long while, it felt like a kind of reckoning was coming. The house creaked. The walls settled under the weight of time. But she didn't move. She had retreated to her room, as if waiting for the world to collapse in on itself again. She hadn't trusted him then, and she probably didn't trust him now. But there was something in the air. Something between them. The silence was no longer just an absence of sound. It was something heavy, thick, that pressed down on his chest. Frank rubbed the back of his neck and turned toward the stairs. He wasn't going to stand here all night. He wasn't going to hide behind the walls he had built up for years. With a heavy sigh, he climbed the stairs. Each step creaked under his weight. He reached the door at the end of the hall and knocked once. No answer. But he wasn't surprised. She wasn't going to invite him in. He pushed the door open gently, and there she was, sitting by the window, her dark hair cascading over her shoulder, her eyes far away, lost in something he couldn't reach. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the soft rustle of the wind outside, the rain hitting the glass in a rhythmic pattern. It wasn't the peaceful sound it should have been. It felt like a warning. "You're not alone here," Frank said, his voice quieter than he meant. "You don't have to be." She didn't turn to look at him, but her lips parted ever so slightly, just enough for him to hear her soft breath. "I know." Frank hesitated. His eyes scanned the room. No chains, no locks, just a place that smelled of old leather and dust. It wasn't much, but it was his. "You should rest," Frank said. He wanted to say more, he wanted to apologize, to make things right. But what could he say? He had already done too much wrong. She finally turned her head to face him, her violet eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "I haven't rested in a long time." Frank didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't a man of many words, never had been. But he knew what it was like to keep moving, to never stop. To always be running from something. "Stay," he said simply. "It's your choice." She didn't move at first. But she didn't push him away either. Instead, she stood, her movements slow, deliberate, as if testing the air. As if testing him. Frank stepped aside as she walked past him, her skin faintly shimmering under the low light. For a brief moment, he caught her reflection in the window. She looked different. The woman he had saved. The woman he had failed. She wasn't just a weapon. She wasn't just a tool. She was human. And that terrified him. But she had made a choice. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding from the world, not from him. She was staying. Frank watched her walk into the hallway, into the room she had chosen. The door clicked softly behind her. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the closed door. What comes next? He didn't know. But maybe, just maybe, for the first time in a long while, it didn't matter. Frank sat in the silence of his room, the moonlight slipping through the cracks in the wall, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. The storm had passed, but its aftermath lingered, like a weight on his chest that wouldn't let go. The house was still. He could hear her breathing from the other side of the wall. Soft, steady, but every now and then, a tremor would ripple through the quiet, a reminder that they were both haunted by their pasts. Frank leaned back in his chair, the old wooden frame creaking under his weight. He reached for the bottle of whiskey on the shelf, his fingers brushing against the cool glass before pulling it down. He didn't need to drink again, not really. But the quiet, the stillness, it was unbearable. He poured himself a glass, the amber liquid gleaming in the dim light. Sarai had been in her room for hours now, and yet, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that something was unresolved. She had followed him, and for a moment, he had allowed himself to believe that maybe they could find some kind of peace together. But it wasn't that simple. It never was. The faintest sound of movement came from the hallway. Frank's head snapped up, his hand tightening around the glass. He heard the soft thud of footsteps approaching, slow, deliberate. It was her. She stood at the door, her figure silhouetted against the faint light of the corridor, like a ghost, hesitant and yet somehow drawn to him. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. They simply looked at each other. Finally, it was Frank who broke the silence, his voice hoarse. "You can't keep hiding from this." She didn't respond immediately. Her eyes were still distant, but Frank saw the flicker of something there, something raw, something vulnerable. She took a step forward, then another, until she was standing just inside the doorway. "I'm not hiding," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I'm just waiting." Frank stared at her. Waiting? For what? For him to fix everything? For her to heal from the scars she had carried for so long? "You don't need to wait," Frank muttered, more to himself than to her. He was tired of waiting for things to change, tired of pretending that his past could just be washed away. He had lived with the consequences of his actions for too long to believe that things could just go back to normal. But maybe, just maybe, they didn't need to go back to anything. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't see the broken woman, the one who had been sold and abused, the one whose pain was so palpable it seemed to wrap around her like a suffocating blanket. No, this time, he saw the woman who had chosen to stay. The woman who had chosen to trust him, even if only a little. "I don't know how to fix this," Frank said quietly. "But I know that I don't want you to go back there." Siri's gaze softened, but her shoulders remained tense. "I don't want to go back either," she said softly. "But sometimes it feels like there's no place for me here either." Frank stood slowly, his legs stiff from sitting too long. He walked towards her, his steps slow, purposeful. He didn't know what he was doing, but something inside him told him that it was the right thing. He stopped just in front of her, their faces mere inches apart. "You're not a prisoner anymore," Frank said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't owe anyone anything. Especially not me." Siri's eyes flickered, something unspoken passing between them. She opened her mouth to speak, but Frank held up a hand, silencing her. "I'm not asking for anything," he said firmly. I'm just asking you to trust me. For once." Her eyes dropped to the floor, her expression unreadable. Frank could feel the tension in the air, thick, suffocating. And then, without warning, she stepped closer. Her hand reached out, and for the first time, it wasn't a weapon, wasn't a gesture of survival. It was something different. She placed her hand on his chest, her fingers brushing against the fabric of his shirt. Frank's breath hitched in his throat. She was close enough now that he could feel her heartbeat, the warmth of her skin seeping through the thin fabric. "Trust," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "is something I've never known." The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of everything unsaid. Frank reached out slowly, his hand gently cupping her cheek, lifting her head to meet his gaze. "I can't promise you that everything will be easy," Frank said, his voice hushed, but steady. "But I can promise you that you won't have to carry this alone anymore." And for the first time, something inside Siri shifted. The walls she had built around herself, the ones that had kept her locked away from everyone including herself, began to crumble. The pain was still there, the memories still fresh, but maybe there was room for something else now. Something new. Her fingers tightened against his chest. "What if I can't let go?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Frank didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. Instead, he leaned down, his lips brushing against her forehead, a soft, fleeting gesture. "Then we'll take it one step at a time." The moment stretched, neither of them moving. And in that brief stillness, they found something they hadn't known they were searching for. The days passed slowly, like the long, drawn-out hum of a ship in the vast emptiness of space. The estate felt quieter now, as though the very walls had settled into a state of peace that neither Frank nor Sarai had ever known. Frank spent his days working around the house, taking care of things that had long been neglected. Sarai remained mostly inside, quiet and contemplative. She spent hours in the garden, tending to the plants that had begun to take root, just as she had begun to do herself, slowly, carefully, without much thought, but with an undeniable pull. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the property, Frank found her standing by the edge of the small pond, staring out over the water. Her eyes were distant, lost in thought, as if trying to connect the dots of her life in a way that had never been possible before. He walked up behind her, his footsteps soft on the stone path. He had learned by now not to disturb her when she was lost in her thoughts, but today was different. Today, something seemed off. "Hey," Frank called softly, stopping just a few feet away. "You okay?" She didn't turn, but he could see the faint tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers clenched at her sides. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice even but strained. I just need some time." Frank didn't push. He had learned to give her space when she needed it, but the silence stretched on longer than usual. He could feel the unease growing, like an undercurrent beneath the surface. "I used to think that time would heal everything," Frank said, his voice almost a whisper, "but I don't know anymore." Sarai finally turned to face him, her violet eyes searching his. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, and the faint chirping of distant insects. "What happened to you, Frank?" she asked quietly. "Before all of this. Before we came here." Frank stiffened. He had known this moment would come. The question that hung in the air between them, the one that he had been avoiding. His past. "You don't want to know," he replied, the words coming out harsher than he intended. It's not something I like to talk about." But Sarai didn't look away. She didn't flinch. She just stood there, waiting. Waiting for him to tell her, for him to open up, just as she had done. "I used to be someone else," he said, his voice quieter now, as if confessing something he had buried deep inside. "I was a soldier. A commander, actually. And I made decisions. Decisions that cost people their lives." Sarai didn't speak. She simply waited, her gaze unwavering. "I was stationed on Tyrion's gate," he continued, his eyes falling to the ground as the memories came rushing back. "A mission gone wrong. A civilian evacuation. I thought we had it under control, but it all went to hell. I couldn't save them. I couldn't save anyone." He felt the weight of the guilt crushing him, just like it always did. The memories of that day, the screams, the fire, the silence that followed. He had carried it with him, like a shadow that refused to leave. "You didn't cause it," Sarai said, stepping closer, her voice low but firm. "You can't carry that burden forever. Frank's gaze snapped to hers. "You don't know what it's like, Siri," he said sharply. "To watch people die, to know you failed them. It never goes away. No matter how hard you try to bury it." Siri reached out, her hand lightly resting on his arm. Her touch was soft, grounding. "I know what it's like to carry the weight of others' pain," she said quietly. "I know what it's like to be broken, to feel like you're not even human anymore. But we're still here, Frank. Both of us. And that means something." Her words hit him harder than he expected, stirring something deep within him. He really looked at her, and for the first time, he saw her not as a victim, not as a mirror to his own failures, but as someone who had fought to survive, just like him. Someone who had chosen to live, despite everything. "I don't know if I can let go," Frank admitted, his voice rough. "Of what I did, of who I was." Siri's expression softened. "You don't have to let go all at once. You don't have to forget. But you do need to forgive yourself." Frank swallowed hard, the lump in his throat threatening to choke him. He had never been good at forgiveness, not for others, and certainly not for himself. But with Siri standing there, offering him something he hadn't thought possible, understanding, compassion, it didn't seem as impossible as it once had. He let out a long, shaky breath. "I'll try," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "But I don't know if I can ever forgive myself." Siri didn't respond immediately. She just nodded, her hand still resting on his arm, offering him a silent promise, a promise that she would be there, no matter how long it took. The two of them stood there, in the fading light, the silence between them filled with something new. Something neither of them had expected to find. For the first time, Frank didn't feel so alone. The next morning, the estate was still. The air carried a soft mist, wrapping around the stone walls like a blanket, as though hiding the world outside. Frank awoke to the faint rustling of leaves, a sound that felt almost out of place after years of relentless battles and constant noise. For the first time in years, there was peace in his chest, a quiet that wasn't filled with guilt or shame. He lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling above him, listening to the gentle sounds of the house. The morning light was just starting to creep through the cracks in the curtains, casting soft beams across the room. For a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to believe that this could be his life now, quiet, slow, simple. But deep inside, he knew it wasn't that easy. The world outside still existed, and the ghosts of his past weren't ready to let go. Frank stretched and pushed himself up from the bed. His movements were slow, deliberate. He had become accustomed to moving in ways that kept him alert, ready for danger at a moment's notice. But here, in this place, it felt different. The tension was still there, buried beneath the surface, but it wasn't as suffocating as it used to be. He stepped into the hallway, the cool air of the house brushing against his skin. He could hear the faint sound of movement from downstairs. Siri. She had been quiet since their conversation by the pond the day before, but something about her stillness spoke volumes. She was as much a mystery to him as he was to her. Frank made his way downstairs, his footsteps echoing softly in the empty space. When he entered the kitchen, he found her sitting at the table, her back straight, her fingers lightly tapping against the surface. Her eyes were distant, lost in thought. "Morning," Frank said, leaning against the doorframe. Siri didn't look up right away. Instead, she let out a quiet sigh and finally met his gaze. "Morning." She looked different this morning, softer somehow. There was something in her expression, a weariness, but also a sense of peace. The kind of peace that only came after a storm had passed. "What's on your mind?" Frank asked, moving toward the counter to pour himself a cup of coffee. She hesitated before answering, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been thinking about what you said. About forgiveness." Frank paused, the mug halfway to his lips. He set it down slowly, turning to face her. "Yeah. You said you didn't know if you could ever forgive yourself," Sarai continued, her eyes searching his. "But you don't have to forgive yourself all at once. Maybe you just need to forgive the person you were before." Frank's jaw tightened, the weight of her words settling in. "I don't know if I can." Sarai nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving his. "Maybe it's not about erasing the past. Maybe it's about accepting that it's part of you. It doesn't define you, but it's there. And you don't have to be the man you were before." Her words were quiet, but they hit him harder than anything he'd ever heard. He had spent so much of his life running from who he was, from the things he had done. But maybe, just maybe, she was right. Maybe it wasn't about changing the past. Maybe it was about letting go of the need to be someone else. "You're right," Frank said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "But it's hard." Sarai smiled faintly, a small, sad smile that seemed to say more than words ever could. "I know. But we can figure it out. Together." For a moment, the world seemed to fall away. The noise, the tension, the weight of their pasts, none of it mattered. All that mattered was the stillness between them. The understanding. The connection that had grown between them over the past few weeks. Frank reached out, placing a hand gently on the table in front of her. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She simply watched him, waiting for him to say something more. "I'm not perfect," he said quietly, his voice steady but tinged with a vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to show. "I've done things I can never take back. But I want to try, to be better. For you. For both of us." Sarai's smile softened. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing lightly against his. "You don't have to be perfect. You just have to try." Frank's heart beat a little faster at her touch. There was something in the way she looked at him, something that made him believe, for the first time in a long time, that maybe he wasn't beyond redemption. They sat there for a long time, in the quiet of the kitchen, the world outside forgotten for a while. For the first time, Frank felt like he was in the right place. Like he had a reason to stay. But in the back of his mind, a warning nagged at him. There was no such thing as peace without a cost. Suddenly, the low hum of the estate's comm system broke the silence. Frank looked up, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon hidden under the table. He could feel his pulse quicken, the shift in the air that signaled danger. Sarai's eyes widened, and she looked toward the door. "What is it?" Frank stood slowly, his movements deliberate, his senses on high alert. "Trouble." The comm system crackled again, the voice coming through distorted but clear enough to understand. "Frank Wren. You're being summoned. Return immediately." Frank's heart sank. The past, it seemed, was never far behind. The air had grown thick with tension as the comm signal faded, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. Frank's hand lingered near his sidearm, the weight of the gun a small comfort in a world that had begun to spin out of control once again. He could feel the urgency in the call, the unmistakable voice that had once been the sound of his doom. Sarai remained motionless, her gaze flicking between Frank and the door. "Who was that?" she asked. her voice sharp yet laced with something that resembled concern. Frank took a deep breath, steadying himself. "A shadow from my past," he muttered, his eyes narrowing. The world outside the estate had always been a battlefield. He'd made enemies, buried some, and left others behind. But some enemies didn't stay buried. "Trouble?" Sarai asked softly, her voice edged with understanding. She wasn't asking about the danger. She was asking about him, about his burden, his demons. Frank's lips pressed into a thin line. "More than that," he replied. "It's something I should have left behind a long time ago." His gaze flickered briefly to Sarai, and for the first time, he allowed himself to see her as something other than a responsibility. There was a flicker of something, trust, maybe, in the way she watched him, not with fear, but with the understanding that had grown between them. Frank's jaw tightened. He couldn't let her get dragged into this. Not now. Not when she had just started to heal. His hand drifted away from the weapon. "Stay here," he said, his voice quieter than before. Sarai's expression softened, but she didn't argue. She simply nodded. There was an unspoken understanding now between them. She wasn't going to back down. As Frank turned towards the door, he was already anticipating the worst. He had spent a lifetime dodging the ghosts of his past, but they were back now, knocking on his door, demanding answers. He wasn't going to run. Not again. The house was eerily still as Frank walked through the long corridors, the sound of his boots echoing in the quiet. He moved with purpose, every step a reminder of the life he had once lived. He had never wanted this kind of conflict, this kind of violence. But it had always followed him. He stepped outside into the misty air, the weight of the morning pressing down on him. The estate's exterior had been peaceful moments ago, but now it seemed oppressive, the stillness broken only by the distant sound of the comm system that still crackled in his mind. Frank's hand brushed against the side of the house, the cold stone a sharp contrast to the warmth that had been gathering inside of him. It was only a matter of time before the storm hit, and he wasn't ready. He hadn't been ready for this moment in years. The distant rumble of engines grew louder, cutting through the quiet like a knife. Frank's heart began to race, adrenaline kicking in as his instincts sharpened. The shadows were here. Sarai joined him a moment later, her presence unwavering, standing beside him without hesitation. Her eyes were filled with the same quiet resolve that had held them together during their brief but intense journey. She was ready for whatever came next. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice low, but firm. Frank didn't answer right away. Instead, he let the silence stretch between them. The world outside seemed to hold its breath. He looked at her, the soft mist swirling around them, and for the briefest of moments, everything seemed clear. "I don't know what's going to happen," Frank said softly, "but I won't let them take you." Sarai didn't respond immediately. She simply stood there, the weight of his words settling between them. In her silence, Frank saw the depth of her own struggle, the walls she had built around herself, the battles she had fought alone. And then, as if the air itself had finally shifted, the ship broke through the mist, descending slowly toward the estate. It was an unfamiliar vessel, low, sleek, and unmarked. Its engines hummed softly, cutting through the mist, its silhouette ominous against the pale sky. Frank's body tensed, and he reached for his sidearm again, feeling the familiar weight in his hand. But this time, he wasn't alone. Sarai was beside him, her posture calm but alert. She was ready. The ship touched down with a soft thud, its engines powering down, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. For a moment, nothing moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, the door opened. A figure stepped out, tall and imposing, with a presence that seemed to suck the air from the space between them. Frank's heart skipped a beat as the man's face came into view. It was Marshal Darren. He looked as calm as ever, his expression unreadable. He didn't carry a weapon, but the energy around him felt charged, like the calm before a storm. "We need to talk," Darren said, his voice smooth, controlled. Frank's gaze narrowed. "I'm listening." Darren stepped forward, his movements deliberate. "You've made a mistake, Frank." This he gestured to the house, to the life Frank had tried to build. "It's not how this ends." Frank's eyes flickered to the door, to Sarai, but he didn't let his focus waver from Darren. "I've made plenty of mistakes," he said quietly. "But this isn't one of them." Darren's eyes flickered briefly to Sarai, but he didn't acknowledge her directly. Instead, he focused on Frank, his posture unchanged. "You think you can just walk away from everything, don't you? But you're wrong. You can't hide from this life. From the people you've crossed." "I'm not hiding," Frank replied, his voice firm. "I'm done running." Darren's lips twisted into a smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Then why are you still here, Frank?" Before Frank could respond, the sky darkened. The storm that had been building in the distance had finally arrived. The wind picked up, howling through the trees. The first raindrops hit the ground, followed by a torrential downpour. Frank glanced at Darren, but the man didn't flinch. He stood there, undeterred, like this was all part of some twisted plan. Frank stepped forward. "I'm not going anywhere." Darren met his gaze. "Neither am I." And then, without another word, the two men squared off, the storm raging around them, setting the stage for the final confrontation. The rain was relentless, but it didn't matter. For the first time in years, Frank stood facing someone who wasn't afraid to call him out, to challenge him to face the consequences of his actions. And somehow, it felt right. Sarai stood behind him, her figure a silent anchor. Frank had always lived with the weight of his past, but now, it felt different. There was a certain steadiness to her presence. She wasn't just following him anymore, she was standing by him. And that made all the difference. The two men locked eyes, Darren and Frank, and for a moment, the world seemed to slow down. The storm was an almost poetic backdrop to their tense standoff. The howling wind, the rain pelting against their skin, it all faded into the background as they sized each other up. Darren spoke first, his voice cutting through the noise of the storm. "You think you can protect her?" He sneered, gesturing toward Sarai, who stood a few steps behind Frank. "You think that just because you decided to be the hero, it's all going to magically get better? You've been running from this your whole life." Frank's jaw clenched, but he didn't back down. "You don't know anything about me," he said, his voice low, steady. "And you sure as hell don't know anything about her." Darren chuckled, a cold, humorless sound. "I know enough. You're just a soldier who played at redemption, but it's too late. You can't outrun your past forever, Frank." The words hit harder than Frank expected, but he didn't show it. Instead, he stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "I'm done running," he said, voice carrying the weight of years of regret. "And I'm not going to let you use her as leverage. Not again." Darren took a step back, looking Frank up and down, sizing him up. "You think you can stop me?" You think you're the only one who's been living with the ghosts of their past? I've got the Union behind me. They'll come for you, Frank. And they'll make you wish you never picked up that gun. A tense silence followed, the only sound a heavy rainfall and the wind rustling through the trees. Frank knew Darren was right. He had enemies. Powerful ones. But this time, he had something different, something that had been absent for a long time. A reason to fight. The rain continued to fall harder, and the air thickened with an almost electric charge. Frank turned to Sarai, his gaze softening for a moment before returning to Darren. I'm not afraid of you, he said, his voice hard, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, determination, purpose. Sarai's voice broke the silence, calm and clear. We've both been running from our pasts. But now, we stand our ground. Darren's eyes narrowed as he watched them. It was clear he hadn't expected this. The tension in the air was palpable, and for the first time, Frank felt like he wasn't alone in this fight. Sarai had found her voice. And she wasn't going anywhere. Darren's smile faded as he assessed the situation. The arrogance that had been there earlier was starting to crack. He hadn't planned on this. Then, with a sudden, almost imperceptible movement, Frank reached for his sidearm, the weight of the weapon familiar in his grip. But just as his hand wrapped around the hilt, a shadow appeared behind Darren. Two figures, cloaked in the storm's embrace, emerged from the mist. Frank's hand instinctively went to his sidearm again, but the figures were not there to fight. They were there to watch. Silent, calm, almost ghostly in their approach. The storm had become an omen, something bigger was coming. Sarai stood tall, her eyes scanning the newcomers. Frank felt her tension before he saw it. The energy in the air had shifted. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore, it was a reckoning. For all of them. Darren's gaze flickered between Frank and the figures, confusion flashing in his eyes. He didn't recognize them, and for a moment, Frank felt an odd sense of relief. This wasn't about union politics. It was about something far bigger. The truth. The reckoning. The first figure stepped forward, a woman, tall and lithe, with a face that was both familiar and foreign. Her eyes were a piercing shade of violet, glowing faintly in the storm's light. She was an empathy, like Sarai, but something about her was different. Older, perhaps. Wiser. Marshal Darren, she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. We've been watching you. The second figure, a man, remained silent. His presence was enough. A subtle power radiated from him, and Frank knew without a doubt that these weren't just casual observers. They were something else entirely. Something that didn't belong to the Union. Darren tensed, his hand hovering over his weapon. But the woman's gaze held him in place. We've seen your operations, she continued, and we've seen the people you've destroyed. Darren opened his mouth to speak, but she cut him off. It's over. You're done. The words hung in the air, the weight of them sinking into the ground like the rain. Darren's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. There was nothing he could say. Frank and Sarai stood side by side, their backs to the storm, their eyes fixed on the scene unfolding in front of them. This was it. The truth had come, and it wasn't going to be ignored anymore. The woman turned her gaze to Frank and Sarai, her eyes softer now. We've been watching you both too. And we know what you've done. The world will change, but not today. She raised her hand, and the storm seemed to intensify, the air crackling with an unseen energy. And then, without another word, she turned and walked back into the mist, the figure following her. Darren stood frozen, his mind racing. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected anyone to see him, to know the truth. Frank stood still, his hand still on his weapon, but the moment had passed. There was no fight left in him. Not today. The storm began to fade, the air clearing, and Frank exhaled slowly, the weight lifting from his chest. Sarai didn't speak, but her presence beside him said everything. They had made it through. For now. The mist was thickening around them again. Frank and Sarai remained at the edge of the clearing, their eyes watching the horizon where the storm had started to abate. There was a strange stillness in the air now, unnatural, almost suffocating. The figures who had appeared earlier were gone, but their presence lingered like a shadow. "Do you think they'll come back?" Sarai asked, her voice low, almost hesitant, but it held a strength in it that Frank couldn't ignore. Frank didn't answer right away. His hand was still resting on the sidearm at his hip, but his grip had relaxed. It wasn't fear that held him, but something more complex. The truth was, he didn't know what to expect next. "I don't know," Frank muttered, his gaze fixed on the trail the mysterious figures had taken into the dense woods. "But whatever happens next, it's bigger than us." Sarai nodded, her violet eyes scanning the trees. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel the anxiety of being hunted. There was no urgency in her movements, no desperate need to flee. The silence between them was comfortable, something neither of them had felt in years. But that silence was broken by a sudden, sharp sound like a distant snap of a twig. Frank's instincts kicked in before he even had the chance to think. He motioned for Sarai to stay back as he moved toward the noise. His steps were quiet, calculated, as he crouched low, trying to keep hidden. "Frank." Sarai's voice was almost a whisper, but it was enough to stop him. He turned toward her, his hand signaling for her to be quiet. "What is it?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Sarai's expression shifted as she stared into the distance. Her senses were tuned to something beyond just sight, something deeper. "I feel something, or someone," she said, her voice betraying a hint of unease. "Not quite hostile, but not friendly either." Frank didn't move, his mind processing the information. "Get ready. Stay close." They both crouched low and began moving stealthily through the underbrush, careful not to make a sound. The weight of what was about to unfold hung heavy in the air. The world around them felt too still, too quiet. It was almost as if the forest itself was holding its breath. They reached the edge of the forest, where the thick trees began to part and reveal a small clearing. And there, in the center of it all, stood a figure, an old man, his appearance ragged and worn, his clothes patched together from what looked like old military fatigues. He wasn't alone. Behind him, standing like a shadow, was another figure. A woman. She was tall, imposing, with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness, the same violet shade as Sarai's. But there was something different about her, something harder. She wore a worn exosuit, its joints creaking slightly as she moved. Frank's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The people who had been watching them. The figures who had appeared from nowhere, who knew things they shouldn't. And now they were standing right in front of them. "Who are you?" Frank demanded, his voice steady but carrying a sharp edge. The old man smiled faintly, his eyes gleaming with a knowing, almost amused look. "We're the ones who've been watching you, Frank Wren. And Sarai, well, We've been waiting for you. Sarai didn't say anything, but her posture shifted. She was waiting, gathering her strength. What do you want? Frank asked, stepping forward, his hand twitching near his weapon. He wasn't sure what kind of game these people were playing, but he wasn't about to let them control the situation. The woman spoke first, her voice cold, calculating. We don't want anything. Not from you, at least. Her eyes locked with Sarai's, and Frank noticed a flicker of something pass between them. Recognition. Understanding. But you, Sarai, you're more important than you think. Sarai stiffened at the mention of her name, her eyes narrowing slightly. I'm done being used, she said, her voice low but fierce. So if you think you're here to play some game with me, you're wrong. The old man chuckled softly. I never said we were playing a game. We just want you to know your true purpose. The one you've been running from. Frank glanced at Sarai, noticing the way her hands clenched into fists. He could feel the tension rising between them, like a silent storm gathering strength. I've had enough of your cryptic bullshit, Frank said, stepping closer to the old man. If you're here to threaten her, you're wasting your time. The woman took a step forward, her boots making a soft crunch against the wet ground. No threats, she said, her voice low and deliberate. Just the truth. Sarai took a step back, her eyes darting between the old man and the woman. What truth? She asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. What is it that you want from me? The old man's smile widened. We don't want anything from you. We just want you to understand your place in all of this. You were never meant to be a weapon, Sarai. You were meant to lead. Frank felt a chill run down his spine as the words settled between them. The forest, the rain, even the world itself seemed to hold its breath. Sarai's expression shifted. Confusion, anger, and disbelief all played across her features. Lead? Lead what? I'm not some savior. I'm just trying to survive. The old man's gaze softened. Survival has never been enough for you, Sarai. You're meant for more. But you'll have to accept who you truly are before you can find out what that is. Frank's heart was pounding in his chest. The weight of the moment was suffocating. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about something far larger than either of them could have imagined. Something that was now beyond their control. The woman stepped forward, her eyes locked onto Frank's. And you, Frank Wren, she said, her voice like a whisper in the dark. You're part of this too. Whether you like it or not. The tension in the air was so thick that it felt like it could be sliced with a knife. The old man's lips curled into a knowing smile. The storm is coming, Frank. And this time, you won't be running from it. Sarai turned her back to them, her eyes scanning the forest. I never asked for this, she muttered under her breath, her voice a mix of frustration and uncertainty. Frank reached for her arm, gently pulling her closer to him. We don't have a choice, Sarai. But we'll face it together. In that moment, they both understood, nothing would ever be the same. They had been marked by something larger, something that had been watching them for longer than they could comprehend. But now, the storm had arrived. And there was no escaping it. The rain continued to fall in heavy sheets, yet there was no comfort in it. The cold water clung to their skin, as if the world itself was washing away any remnants of hope. Frank stood at the edge of the clearing, his eyes scanning the horizon, his hand resting firmly on the hilt of his weapon. Sarai, at his side, seemed lost in thought. Her eyes, though usually sharp and observant, were distant now, haunted by the words that had just been spoken. "We'll face it together," Frank repeated softly, his voice laced with determination. But deep down, he wasn't sure if that was enough. The old man's cryptic words echoed in his mind. "You were never meant to be a weapon, Sarai. You were meant to lead." It was the first time Frank had seen Sarai so uncertain. The once fiercely independent woman was now visibly shaken, her usual confidence replaced by doubt. She was caught between the person she had been, someone broken and silenced, and the person they were telling her she was meant to become. The leader. But could she truly step into those shoes? "What do they mean by that?" Sarai asked, her voice trembling slightly. The vulnerability was unmistakable, something Frank hadn't heard from her before. "Lead what, Frank? I don't even know who I am anymore." Frank took a step closer, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "You are exactly who you've always been, Sarai. You just haven't seen it yet. You've been strong through everything they've thrown at you, but they've kept you from your true self." Sarai shook her head, her eyes fixed on the ground. "But if they were right? If I really am meant for something bigger, then what do I do with that? How do I live with that? How do I live knowing everything I've done, every person I've hurt?" Before Frank could respond, a low, familiar hum cut through the silence, interrupting the moment. Frank's hand instinctively went to his sidearm, but Sarai stopped him. "No, it's not them," she said, her voice steady. "I can feel it, this is different. They're not coming for us." Frank frowned, narrowing his eyes. He had come to trust Sarai's intuition over the years, and he could sense the change in the air too. Something else was out there. From the trees, the sound grew louder, a sharp, mechanical noise, like a giant rotor spinning through the air. Frank and Sarai shared a glance. It wasn't a ship, it wasn't a drone. It was something else. A figure emerged from the dense underbrush, its silhouette tall and unmistakably humanoid. As the figure stepped forward, Frank's heart skipped a beat. The shape of the figure was familiar, almost haunting. "Not again," Frank muttered under his breath. It was him. The man who had abandoned them all. Cale Merrick. Cale had always been the type to hide in plain sight, quiet, calculating, always 2 steps ahead. But now, standing before them, he looked different. His once clean, well-maintained exosuite was now scarred and battered. His eyes were dark, haunted by something beyond their understanding. He wasn't alone this time, though. 2 others flanked him, both armed and steady, their faces hidden beneath their visors. "Sarai," Cale said, his voice cold as it echoed through the clearing. He locked eyes with her. "You know why I'm here." Sarai didn't flinch. She didn't back away. She stood her ground, as if the man who had once been her captor had no power over her anymore. "You came here to finish what you started, didn't you?" Sarai said, her voice sharp with defiance. "But you're too late." Frank stepped forward, positioning himself in front of Sarai, his hand still resting lightly on his sidearm. He wasn't sure how this was going to play out, but one thing was clear: Cale's presence meant trouble. No one could come this close without a reason. "What do you want, Cale?" Frank asked, his voice low, every syllable deliberate. "You know things are different now. You're not in control anymore." Cale's lips curled into a twisted smile, a grimace that seemed almost as though he were apologizing for what he was about to say. "I don't need to be in control, Frank. I just need you to understand." His eyes flicked towards Sarai. She's a weapon, always has been, always will be. You can't protect her from that. She is the weapon. Sarai's eyes narrowed. You don't get to say that anymore, she said, her voice steady but her fists clenched at her sides. Frank could feel the change in the air, the weight of their confrontation. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about identity. About who they were, who they'd become and who they were willing to fight for. We're not doing this again, Frank said, his voice cold and unwavering. Sarai's not your weapon. And neither am I. Kale raised his hand, signaling the two other figures to approach. One of them carried a weapon that Frank instantly recognized, a high-powered disruptor rifle, the kind used by the Union's most elite enforcers. The other figure carried a strange, unfamiliar device that Frank could only describe as some kind of energy generator. I'm not here to fight you, Frank, Kale said, his voice now quieter, more dangerous. But if you stand in my way again, I'll have no choice. The tension between them was palpable, heavy, and filled with the unspoken weight of their past. Frank had once trusted this man, had fought beside him, but now there was nothing but hatred between them. We're not going anywhere with you, Frank spat, his fingers tightening around his weapon. Not again. The quiet moment was broken by a sudden flash of light. The device Kale was holding hummed to life, its energy charging at a rapid pace. Frank's instincts kicked in. Sarai, move! Frank shouted, pulling her to the ground just as the energy pulse shot out, tearing through the air. The blast hit a nearby tree, and the explosion sent debris flying, but Frank and Sarai had already scrambled behind a large rock, taking cover. Frank glanced at Sarai, his heart pounding in his chest. Are you okay? He asked urgently. Sarai nodded, her eyes wide but focused. We need to stop him. We need to finish this. Frank glanced at Kale, who stood a few meters away, his menacing grin still in place. We will, Frank said grimly. Together. The battle had begun, and there was no going back. The air around them seemed to ripple with tension, thick enough to suffocate. Kale's energy weapon hummed in the distance, crackling with anticipation. Frank and Sarai crouched behind the rocky outcrop, their breathing heavy, their minds racing. Frank's grip on his weapon tightened as he scanned the area. We need to move. If we don't, they'll trap us here. Sarai's voice was calm, almost eerie in its stillness. I've never been good at waiting. Her eyes gleamed with resolve. The woman who had once been a prisoner of her own emotions, who had lived to mirror the pain of others, was now fully in control. She wasn't just fighting for survival, she was fighting for her identity, for her freedom, for the right to exist beyond the chains that had once defined her. We fight now, Frank said, his voice grim and determined. No more running. No more hiding. Sarai nodded once, her violet eyes meeting his. We finish it? For good. They stood at the same time, moving in synchronized fluidity, as though they had already fought this battle 1,000 times. Frank was the first to break cover, darting out and firing a shot that grazed one of Kale's men, sending him into a dive behind a nearby rock. The other figure, holding the disruptor rifle, aimed and fired, but Frank was already rolling to the side, narrowly missing the blast. Get down! Frank yelled to Sarai as he dove behind a nearby stone pillar, taking cover. Sarai, in turn, vaulted over the rock with agility, coming up just behind him. Without a word, she activated her own weapon, firing energy pulses that sent Kale's remaining guards scattering. Kale's voice rang out, smooth but edged with malice. You think you can defeat me? I've trained for this. You're out of your depth. Frank gritted his teeth, taking a quick glance at Sarai, whose stance was calm, eyes narrowed on their enemy. She didn't flinch, not even a little. You've always been 2 steps behind, Kale, she called out, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. You've never understood the power of choice. You only saw me as a weapon. Now I'm choosing. Frank grinned. There it was, Sarai's moment of clarity, the true moment of her liberation. She was no longer bound by her past, by the pain she'd endured. She was choosing who she wanted to be. Kale scowled, his patience thinning. He lunged forward, a flash of motion and fury, intent on taking them both down. Frank's heart raced, but his instincts were faster. He fired, but Kale was faster, sidestepping the blast with a speed that Frank couldn't match. He shot again, narrowly missing Kale's shoulder. Sarai, however, wasn't about to let Kale's arrogance go unpunished. She sprang forward, her movements as fluid as a predator closing in on its prey. Before Kale could react, she was on him, a blur of blue skin and sharp, precise movements. She struck like lightning, her knee slamming into his midsection, sending him crashing to the ground. For a brief moment, Kale seemed stunned, but he quickly regained his composure, a smile of cold amusement forming on his lips. Is this it, then? Your big moment? He rose, wiping blood from his lip, his eyes flashing with malice. Frank knew the fight wasn't over. Kale had always been resilient, too crafty for his own good. No, Frank said, his voice low, but it's the beginning of the end. Sarai's eyes flashed, a deep, primal anger burning in them. She had never been allowed to feel anger, at least not in the way she felt it now, pure, unrestrained, her rage her own. It didn't come from a place of vengeance, it came from the heart of someone who had been told they were nothing, someone who had been silenced. But not anymore. Without a word, she lunged at Kale again, but this time, it wasn't just about the physical fight. It was about claiming her space in the world. She was no longer the empathy. She was no longer the weapon. She was a force of her own making. Kale barely had time to react before she grabbed him by the collar of his damaged suit and slammed him into the ground. The energy weapon was still in his hand, but now it felt useless against her strength. Get off me! Kale growled, but Sarai didn't hesitate. She knew what she had to do. With one swift motion, she twisted Kale's arm behind his back, pinning him down with a force that would have been impossible for the man who once commanded entire armies. She looked him in the eyes, her expression unwavering. You thought I would break, she said quietly. You thought I was nothing. But you were wrong. Frank stepped forward, his eyes cold and unfeeling. You're done here, Kale. Kale's eyes flicked back and forth between the two, but he knew it was over. His past actions had finally caught up to him. No more lies. No more manipulation. You don't get to choose anymore, Frank said, his voice low but firm. It's over. Sarai held Kale there for a moment longer, watching as his arrogance faded into something else, fear. Fear of the truth. Fear of the people he had underestimated. Finally, she released him, stepping back. Go, she said. But know this, if you ever come near us again, you won't get a second chance. Kale didn't answer, his lips pressed into a thin line, but he knew she meant it. His pride was the only thing left, his empire had crumbled, and now, all he had was his own failure. He picked himself up, disappearing into the woods, dragging his wounded pride behind him. Frank turned to Sarai, his eyes softer now, a hint of relief in them. "It's over," he said. "You did it. You saved us." Sarai looked at him, her gaze steady and unwavering. "We saved each other." In that moment, something shifted between them. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were partners in every sense of the word. The quiet of the forest settled around them, the sound of the storm finally fading into the distance. For the first time in years, Frank felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. The kind that didn't come from escaping, but from standing firm. The kind that came from knowing that, together, they had the strength to face whatever came next. "Where do we go from here?" Sarai asked quietly, her voice no longer tinged with doubt. Frank smiled, a real smile, the kind that came from the heart. "Anywhere," he said, "as long as it's together." And for the first time in a long time, Frank and Sarai had the freedom to choose their path. Together. The smoke had cleared. The battle was over. But Frank wasn't sure if he'd won. He had saved her. Or maybe, in the end, she saved him. In a world where survival means losing your humanity, where the galaxy spins its own twisted web of fate, could love really be the answer? Frank stood at the edge of the unknown, staring into the void. And there, beside him, she stood. The girl with stars in her eyes. A woman who had never known love, but perhaps, had always known the truth. They had fought for this moment. But now that it was here, Frank couldn't help but wonder, is this the end of their story? Or the beginning? In the silence that followed, there was no victory cheer. No triumphant music. Only the hum of the universe, as it moved around them, indifferent, uncaring, yet somehow still, beautiful. She turned to him, her eyes meeting his for the first time without fear. And in that moment, Frank understood. It wasn't about what they had to survive anymore. It was about what they chose to live for. "Is this real?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Frank smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "I don't know. But it's ours." And as the stars above them blinked, brighter than before, Frank whispered, "Maybe that's enough." But what if it wasn't? Could they really escape the weight of the universe? Could love ever truly be enough? Or are we all just waiting for a chance to choose? If you believe in the impossible, stay with us. Hit that subscribe button. Because the truth is out there. But the choice? That's something only you can make.